Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Orleans, president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by my old friend and mentor, Cheng Li, who is director of the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution. When I say he's my mentor, when I have questions about elite politics in China, I call Cheng Li and say, who is this person? What should I be thinking? What should I be doing? But today, we will cover some of that. But he is the author of a very recent book called Class Shanghai, Reshaping U.S. China Engagement. I completed it this past weekend, and it is an absolute must read. He goes back to his childhood home, Shanghai. He talks about the role of Shanghai in kind of China's formation of policy, the role of people from Shanghai, talks about what's going on in Shanghai, and really, I think, makes a compelling case for how we need to look at China when we formulate U.S.-China relations in a much more nuanced way. If I listed all of Cheng Li's publications, we wouldn't have time for the program, but like all of his publications, it contains unique data sets which he compiles and which sheds incredible light on what's going on in China and the way we need to think about U.S.-China relations. So thank you for the book, Cheng Li. Thank you for all you have done for increasing understanding of China in the United States. Thank you for your service on the board of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. And thank you for being such a great friend. So let me start out the program with a question, which is, this book was a long time in the making. Why this book? Why now? And why did it take you 10 years to write it? It's pretty big, but it didn't justify 10, pretty long, but it doesn't justify 10 years.
Well, thanks, Steve, for that overly generous introduction. You are my mentor. I'm honored to have the opportunity to exchange views and ideas with you and with the distinguished audience of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Now to your three-part question. First, why this book? I believe that among the many forces shaping China's domestic transformation and its role on the world stage, none may prove more significant than the rapid emergence and explosive growth of the Chinese middle class. At the center of this story in China is the city of Shanghai. My study of Shanghai reflects an overall theme, which is Shanghai is not a monolithic entity, and certainly China is not either. Middle-class Shanghai actually reveals China's unsettled future, because even Shanghai modifies what I call two tails of a city. Now, in my view, Shanghai was, is, and will be paradoxical. Historically, Shanghai was the most westernized Chinese city, but it was also the birthplace of the CCP and the center of the Maoist radicalism during the Cultural Revolution, during which I grew up. Presently, Shanghai is often regarded as the frontier city of the market reforms, opening up, and the cosmopolitanism. But at the same time, the city is also seen as what the Chinese call the head of dragon in China's industrial policy and the state capitalism. And finally, for the future, Shanghai can serve as the vanguard of the middle class worldly voices, views, and values. Yet, this city may increasingly become the showcase of China's growing nationalism and the mercantilist global outreach. Now, my point here is that we should place Shanghai's future and China's future in an ever-changing domestic and international context. It is neither predetermined nor stagnant. Now, this leads me to your second part of the question, why now? Unfortunately, the ongoing policy and the political discourse on China in the United States today disproportionately focus on Beijing, on the Chinese authoritarian system, on the China's threat, on the fatalistic view, often threatening the most, also treating the most populous country in the world in a monolithic way. Now, a study of Shanghai, and especially its dynamic middle class, I hope, can challenge this narrative and broaden our perspectives and policy choices. Now, why 10 years? It is embarrassing to have spent 10 years writing this book, although I completed 5 other books, including edited or co-edited volumes during these 10 years. An important reason that it took such a long time to complete this is actually by design. The idea was to conduct a longitudinal survey of foreign educated elites in Shanghai, which with one survey every 2 or 3 years for 3 surveys altogether. As we know, it was becoming increasingly difficult in recent years to conduct survey research in China for a foreign scholar like myself, even though these surveys were commissioned by a Chinese survey firm with a limited number of participants. I completed only 2 surveys instead of the 3 that had been planned. Steve, if I may, I want to use the 1 minute or a couple of minutes. I would like to share with you the story about what triggered me to write this book at the first place. As I described in the prologue, a very powerful avant-garde art piece by Wang Yongping at the 2000 Shanghai Biennial, 双年展, held in the Shanghai Art Museum, inspired me to rethink global integration at the time of destructive confrontation. Let me show you a few slides because it's a very important to know this. Now, this is the piece, the replica of the most famous, one of the most famous buildings in Shanghai, and first is occupied the HSBC almost 100 years ago. Now that exhibition, it's a material, it's a sand. It has a very interesting name, Bank of Sand and the Sand of Bank. It just got the best award in that exhibition. And but what is intriguing of this, the landmark building is replica, is during the exhibition is gradually drying and disintegrated. Now this is another photo in a different exhibition. This is the famous building, HSBC building. Now this award, the artwork, certainly try to make a point that we should also look at both the impressive impact and the potential disastrous effects of globalization. Now, as we know that not only the Bank of HSBC headquarters, but also in since 1996 become the headquarters of another bank, the Pudong Development Bank, which really led to the birth and the growth of the China's Manhattan in the Pudong. So it's highly, highly symbolic. Now, the impact of pivotal events in this century, whether it be the 9/11 terrorist attack in the United States, the 2008 global financial crisis, and most recently, the COVID-19 global pandemic, as well as the rapid deterioration of the most important bilateral relationship, have all collectively reaffirmed Wang Yongping's sentiment and the fear of the devastating shocks and the after effects that stem from an increasingly interconnected world. Steve, in a real sense, these 2 recent events drove me to complete this book now. Over to you, Steve.
So the book kind of implores, the whole theory of the book, it implores policymakers to have a more nuanced approach to our China policy, taking into account exactly what you just said, the middle class, the middle class in Shanghai, which is such a diverse group, and kind of focus some of its attention on that rather than what you just said, Beijing. So what are our policymakers getting wrong?
Well, you're right. The thesis of my book runs contrary to prevailing view in Washington regarding the failure of the U.S. engagement policy toward China, there are several main components of these negative views. For example, viewing China as a monolithic entity with no distinction between state and society, the so-called a whole of society threat. We're familiar with that term. Now, also viewing the Chinese middle class as a political ally of the party state without recognizing the dynamism and the diversity of this new socioeconomic force and its transitory political role, which I will call, and also viewing the large number of the PRC students and scholars in the United States as spies being weaponized by Beijing, and therefore assuming bilateral educational exchange benefit only China and may undermine American supremacy and American security. Now, this book certainly challenges these distorted views and the resulting wrong policy, which are called wrong policies. The book argues it is premature to announce that the US engagement policy with China under the 8 presidents prior to the Trump administration has failed. According to our friend and Brookings' colleague, Jeff Bader, who served as the senior director of Asia in the Obama White House National Security Council, he actually wrote in 2016, I quote, "East Asia has avoided major military conflicts since the 1970s, after the United States fought 3 wars in the preceding 4 decades, originating in East Asia, with 250,000 lost American lives. This is no small achievement," end quote. In Bader's view, abandoning the engagement policy will likely enhance the risk of war in the region. I'm afraid that the precious peace in the region may come to an end if we do not stop this kind of trajectory. Now, so over to you. This is the what I believe that the policy went wrong. My book is a really humble effort to provide a different angle based on the culture front and from the perspective of people-to-people relations.
So the Biden administration should not be announcing the end of the era of constructive engagement. That is not helpful to.
Absolutely. I was really surprised to see, I understand that the Trump administration already determined to really contain China, or even destroy China from the Beijing's perspective in the same way like we destroy the Soviet Union. But the world has changed. That China is not a Soviet Union. This is not what I said. There have been many world leaders, including American Airlines and German Chancellor, British Prime Minister, Singaporean Prime Minister. I mean, these are American friends and airlines. Certainly, there are a lot of Americans, people like you and me, very cynical about this end of engagement. We can create a different kind of engagement. We should probably put a different emphasis. But to say the end of engagement is a little bit a surprise to me for the Biden administration. Yeah.
I mean, as you know, I completely agree with that. And what puzzles me is exactly Jeff's point, that nobody focuses on it. That, when I first went to Asia in 1972, exactly what Jeff said, 250,000 American soldiers had died on the battlefields of Asia in the prior 4 decades. And since this constructive engagement, no Americans have died on the battlefields of Asia. And that is not a coincidence. The idea that that is not a result of constructive engagement is, I think, not good policy for the American people, and certainly not good policy for people who potentially could die in a war. We'll go back to these issues, but I want to focus some on part of what I so love about the book and all of your books is kind of the data that you kind of compile. And I think to me, and I know a lot about this, it's very, very interesting. You have fascinating numbers on Shanghai's effect on the Politburo and the Standing Committee, the number of people who have served in Shanghai, which clearly is the most international city within China. I mean, there's no question that it is. And you have numbers and what effect they've had on Chinese policy making. So can you give us some of those numbers? Kind of whet people's appetite for getting the book and talk about the contrast between the percentage in the Central Committee versus the Politburo and the Standing Committee.
Okay. Certainly that throughout the contemporary history, Shanghai always held an important position in China's economic, political, social, and cultural life. Of course, some leaders are considered as good leaders, some considered as bad leaders, based on, really different values. For example, we know that in Shanghai, there's a gang of four, also largely come from Shanghai, including Mao's widow. But also there's some good leaders in China's history, in PRC history, like the former foreign minister of Cheng Li and the former premier Zhu Rongji.
Now, for the audience that's not that, the Gang of Four you're referring to is the Cultural Revolution, right. Gang of Four of Wang Guwen, Zhang Huchao, Yao Wenyuan. Yes, so Shanghai has produced some great leaders. They've also produced some of the worst. That's right.
Now, this is again reaffirm what I said that it's a tales of two cities in that regard. And time again, in virtually all major phases of the PRC history, socialist transformation, you mentioned the Cultural Revolution, reform and opening up, and the China's search for global superpower status, Shanghai has proved to be a critical ideological and the political battlefield, too important to lose to competing forces. Now, in the book, a chapter epigraph features a quote. You probably still remember a quote by Zhu Rongji. He said, "It's not the Shanghai people are smart; it's that the smart people come to Shanghai." Now, for 7 consecutive years between 1988 and 1994, Deng Xiaoping spent the Spring Festival holidays in Shanghai, which helped him appreciate Shanghai's cosmopolitan legacy and the distinct culture, especially the large pool of talent. Now, during his stay in Shanghai in 1990, Deng Xiaoping stated that actually this is a direct quote. He said, "One of my big mistakes was I did not include Shanghai when I launched the 4 special economic zone in 1980. Now, that same year, Shanghai launched its historical plan for developing Pudong. Now, Shanghai has enjoyed the strong political backing of powerful patrons in Zhongnanhai and all powerful political elite faction known as the Shanghai Gang, informally established in 1990 by the then party secretary Jiang Zemin, later dominated the national leadership, especially 25-person Politburo and the 7 to 9-person Politburo Standing Committee. As we know, the Politburo Standing Committee is the real, the most powerful leadership body. So in the last, it's the third tier is the 370 plus members of Central Committee. The Shanghai leaders are not too many, probably it's only a few percentage. But in the Politburo and the most powerful Politburo Standing Committee, Shanghai people has a huge representation since 1990. Now, at the present, the Shanghai Gang remains as an important force within Xi Jinping's political coalition. Now, Xi Jinping is not the Shanghai Gang per se, but he also rely on many of the Shanghai leaders. Now, let's see, let me show you a chart that I think is quite revealing to that. Now, this is the Politburo Standing Committee over actually 30 years. The Politburo Standing Committee could be 7, could be 9. Now, the first number is the representative those from Shanghai, either born in Shanghai, most often they advance their career in Shanghai, through Shanghai. So it's a 43% for the 1992, then 29%, 33%, 22%, 29%, 43%. These are all very significant. These are usually general secretary or premier or both, or National People's Congress, and etc. Now, the last line is expected. This is, as we know, that next year they will have a very important 20th Party Congress. We do not know whether it be 7 or 9. I tend to think will be 9 because there's so many people, wanted to have that position, want to get promoted, particularly younger generation. So I'm not sure, but let's say it's 9. These 5 people who from Shanghai or advanced secretary from Shanghai, including Xi Jinping, although his tenure in Shanghai is only 8 months, but he certainly promoted a lot of people from Shanghai, including his current chief of staff. This is the 3 people. The third person is Ding Xuexiang. Highly likely, he currently is his chief staff, and Li Chang is the party secretary of Shanghai. And these 2 people will move to the Power Bill Standing Committee, most likely. Another person is currently Guangdong Party Chief, Li Xi. He also spent a few years in Shanghai as Deputy Party Secretary, Organization Head, and etc. Now, we do not know whether Han Zheng or Wang Funing, whether they will stay or not. We do not know for sure. But let's say that one of them will stay, so it's maybe 5. This will be 56%. And these people will stay in power for a longer period. That also I want to go to detail. So this talk about the power of Shanghai, and also that I think there's a reason we need to pay attention to Shanghai leaders, because sometimes their policy is a little bit different from those from England because of the cosmopolitan experience and etc. Now let me give you some examples that during the Taiwan Strait crisis, in contrast to many hawkish leaders in inland China, the Shanghai leaders, like particularly the mayor at that time, Xu Kuangdi, your good friend, he asked people calm down, particularly our Taiwanese. There are a lot of Taiwanese living in Shanghai. I do not remember. Currently, still there's some relatively big size of Taiwanese community. They ask him to stay in Shanghai. Don't worry, business will continue. And basically the message is we are not going to use force. Don't overreact or scared by the things. The same things you can see that with some incidents under Jiang Zemin, who really have strong ties with Shanghai. He could be seen as a Shanghainese, although he's born in the nearby area. But he loved the Shanghai culture and really promoted the cosmopolitan Shanghai culture. He actually under his watch there's some incidents, including the Taiwan presidential election, the crisis, then the Belgrade embassy bombing in 1999, and also EP3 2001. So he basically restrained largely. So that's the things that I want to emphasize. So we still should think about it that way. Over to you.
It's remarkable. I mean, I always think about it. When you kind of try to explain the Shanghai bomb, is that a uniquely kind of Chinese experience, or is it possible, like we would had times in America when the cabinet of the United States was all from Virginia, or all from New York, or all from Boston, Massachusetts, or especially in the early years. But it's really, I mean, 43, 56, those are amazing percentages.
Oh yeah. I mean, you talk about Virginia, Boston, New York. I want to add Chicago and Obama's, White House, his administration. Really, a lot of Chicago people joined the administration. I don't want to give the name, but so it's not unique. I mean, it's quite common. Partly it's a patron-client ties, political networking. Partly it's related with the importance of the urban centers, and including the talents and many other things. So again, Steve, your excellent question. I think we should put it in the perspective. It's not uniquely Chinese, but certainly Shanghai, over the past 100 years, it's even before the communist regime, you can see that Jiang Jingguo, I mean, under nationalist government, Shanghai is also crucial. It's very, very important. So there's a saying in China, when you want to look at understand China for the past 2,000 years, visit Xi'an. When you want to the past 500 years, go to Beijing. When you want to understand the China in the past 100 years, come to Shanghai.
Yeah, it's fascinating issue. There were times I would be in Shanghai, and especially because I was working in the financial services sector, that the liberalization that was occurring in Shanghai was somewhat inconsistent with what was occurring in the rest of the country. And I worried that Shanghai would be getting too far out front, especially in Pudong, and creating risks for policies there.
Yeah. Well, I share with your sentiment. Yes.
You talk in the book about kind of civil society in Shanghai and its effect on kind of diversity in Shanghai. You also mention, the 2017 Foreign NGO Law, where the Chinese kind of overreacted to a handful of foreign NGOs, which they felt were a threat, and ended up deeply impacting foreign civil society in China. How does that kind of fit into the theme of your book?
Well, Steve, I'm so glad that you have raised this question. As you and I agree, the ongoing deterioration of the U.S.-China relationship is the result of years of disputes, disappointment, disillusionment, and distrust between the two countries. And both sides should draw some lessons from one's own policy mistakes and missteps. So in Beijing, there had been increasing political control over international educational and cultural exchanges prior to the Trump administration beginning its decoupling policies on this front. Although it's not that the scale in terms of decoupling like the US side, and also it maybe the overall purpose is not to decouple, but to want to control. But that has a huge impact, negative impact. So the PRC 2017 Foreign Ngo Law created extensive restrictions on foreign educational institutions and the civil society organization, including National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, including Brookings, Carnegie, among many other institutions, including a lot of NGO, smaller NGO institutions want to engage with China. Most of them actually are China-friendly and not should not be seen as the EU intended, but you really make them very, very difficult. And these are institutions really want to engage in educational culture and people-to-people exchanges. But unfortunately, you hit them so badly. You create an atmosphere, hurt China's own friends. I think this, if there's a lesson China should learn, this is one. And also that's a reaffirm that my book is that certainly my main audience is American audience. So I'm very critical about the US policy toward China. But on the other hand, it's not right to just blame everything to the United States. It's not just a one-way street. I think China should learn a lesson. If you really wanted to put things back on the right track, I think this is kind of a self-review. It's very, very important. So that NGO laws certainly is one of them.
Yeah. One of the other great parts of the book are these kind of nuggets that are buried in the book, and then the charts that follow it up. But you write that there are now 3,651,400 students and scholars have studied abroad and returned to China. I had not heard. To me, that's quite a stunning statistic. Talk about the influence of those returnees, and then you have this incredible chart where you talk about the senior people in kind of Shanghai's educational institutions, and virtually close to 100% of them have studied abroad and returned to Shanghai.
Well, indeed, I mean, these are stunning statistics. Between 1978 and 2019, about 6 million PRC students studied abroad, with a significant percentage coming to the United States. By 2018, over 3.6 million Chinese students and scholars who study abroad had returned to China, representing 85% of all Chinese students and scholars who had completed a degree program. Of course, some of the 15% or more that decided to stay in the United States, like myself as a student and found a new home in the United States. Now, I will show you some slides, but let me first mention that Chinese nationals educated abroad, especially those who study in the United States, have emerged as a distinguished elite group in the PRC. Foreign educated returnees have gained growing influence in all walks of life in China, especially in Shanghai, the country's frontier city for international engagement. 10 years ago, about 20 a quarter of the foreign educated returnees decide to live and stay in China. I do not have the new data. The data was 2009. Now, in chapter 8 of the book, impact of education exchange, returnees in Shanghai, I begin with a question: what do the foreign people in Shanghai in common? That include internationally famous artist Chen Danqing, former Minister of Health, China's former Minister of Health, Chen Zu, China's most popular late-night talk show host, Jing Xin, a transgender woman, Asia's #1 venture capitalist, Shen Nanpeng, former Shanghai Mayor, Xu Kuangdi, the person I mentioned earlier, basketball guru, Yao Ming, the founder of China's first opinion poll company, Yuan Yue, China's most popular medical doctor in combating COVID-19, Zhang Wenhong, and the former IMF Deputy Director Zhu Ming, our mutual friend. They are all foreign educated returnees. Now, without counting for the impact of foreign education, present-day Shanghai is incomprehensible. Now, for your question about the returnees in Shanghai's higher education, let me just give you one set of statistics from my research. Your previous quote is also correct. It's almost sometimes the professors, sometimes the top universities, almost 100%. Now, in 2019, a couple of years ago, this is a study I conducted. Among the top administrators of the top 10 universities in Shanghai, that including president and vice president and provost and etc. 92% of them are foreign educated returnees. Now, definition is you got a degree from foreign country, or you study foreign country for more than 1 year as a visiting professor, visiting scholar, and etc. Now, let me show you some of the overall things. Let me show that one.
Students and scholars studying abroad and returning.
Yeah, so that's the annual things. The blue is students sent out. Orange is those returns. That's each year. This is to all countries, not just the United States. Yeah. That's the chart I made. That is quite remarkable. You can see, particularly recent years, and that trend is really. It's truly a remarkable study abroad movement in
it's
the world. Yeah,
it's gone up roughly at the same rate.
Yeah, it cannot. This is the rapid growth of PRC students in the United States. You can see in the recent decade increased dramatically, but of course that the number ended in 2018. That actually start from 2019 already start to drop. We do not have the new data, partly because of the decoupling policies. As we know that in October 2018, the Trump administration actually had a meeting in the White House. Political team decided to end the educational exchanges based on the Financial Times report. Eventually, President and the U.S. ambassador to China happened to be in the White House. Rejected that plan, but otherwise it could end. But of course, COVID-19 also contributed to that decline.
Peggy Blumenthal, I'll let you go on, but Peggy Blumenthal asked a question, our friend Peggy. Is the United States still the first choice of Shanghai students and their parents?
Well, we do not have reliable data, but again, several things certainly make people have a second thought. We do not know. No matter what, I think still a lot of people wanted to come to from Shanghai or from the country to United States, but relatively speaking, number will decline, and also not only from Shanghai but from other country, other parts of Shanghai, other parts of the country will also decline. But we do not have the number. We already see that applications drop, and also there's a more kind of interest to England, Europe, and also Canada and Australia. But this is a period of uncertainty. We do not have reliable. And Peggy, thank you for your fantastic work. Your firm really played an instructional role in promoting educational exchange. Yeah. Now also let me show this last one. This Chinese students constitute really 33% of the foreign students in the United States. The number 2 country is India, is about 18%. You can see the increase. But I think that era probably is coming to an end.
Yeah. Now, this is the percentage of Chinese students in the United States as a percentage of all foreign students.
Correct. But that's the orange. That's the orange line. The blue is the total number, the absolute number, the specific number. The orange is percentage. Yeah.
Yeah. So what's the percentage of Chinese students that come to the United States versus the rest of the world?
Well, we do not know that number because it's inconsistent. We only have randomly a few years based on the data from the Ministry of Education. It's roughly about 1/3 at certain years, but we do not have the overall number. Sometimes it's between 30% to 40% in some years released by the Ministry of Education and etc. Now, this number, as you mentioned, include those pre-university students, but not include short-term, like 3 months kind of training, do not include that. So again, so that's the answer. I do not have the overall number in terms of these years, but the randomly is between like 30% to 40% or 1/3 basically. Yeah.
Yeah. When we see a normalization in applications, I guess this autumn, with the ending of COVID, we'll see, hopefully we'll get a sense of, did the Trump era basically reduce Chinese students' interest in coming to studying?
Yeah, the recent things, anti-Asia hate crime also have a very powerful effect.
Yeah.
There are so many families, they deeply worry. And but on the other hand, I mean, China's middle class it's really, we talk about total number, it's between 400 to 500 million people. Only 10% of them want to come to the United States, still big size. We should, but there's always that people wanted to go against the trend. So long the decoupling does not officially happen, I think we still will have the sizable applicants from China, from Shanghai. Yeah.
As remarkable, were there more slides you wanted to show?
Oh, no, that's fine. I may use slides that based on what question you ask. Yeah.
Okay.
I prepare a lot of slides for this interview. Yeah.
Yeah, it's terrific, and I mean it's really to whet everybody's appetite. You have to get the book because it's just full of these very interesting graphs, charts, and data. Which again, there's so much discussion kind of the theory, and maybe it's because of my financial services background and my investing background. I like the data. I'm much more interested in the data. But speaking of financial services, you have a chapter that kind of deals with Shanghai as an international financial center. And we had the municipal government early this year kind of say, well, Shanghai has become an international financial center. Well, I guess it depends on your definition, to say the least. And isn't that an area where Shanghai cannot accomplish what it wants to accomplish because of central government policies? That one of the things, when I was in the financial services area, I needed instantaneous data. No one, if anybody interfered in my data, if it was 1 second delayed or 10-second delayed, that would affect a trading decision, which would theoretically affect the profitability of my organization. And also there's a need to be able to litigate a dispute fairly, whether it's the government or a private sector company. And given what the central government policies are, is Shanghai really ever going to make it as an international financial center?
Well, Steve, I fully agree with you that the lack of an independent judiciary or rule of law and interference with communications prevent the implementation of this ambitious plan to make Shanghai a financial center, a global financial center. There are fundamental tensions between tight political control and market liberalization. The same can be said to Hong Kong and Shenzhen. But my research in Shanghai also show something very interesting, in terms of interesting dynamics from the angle of the middle class growing efforts to promote civil society and the legal communities' painstaking work to develop a rule of law including in both the economic and non-economic domains. So we should factor in these kind of development. Now, when I left China to study in the United States in the middle 1980s, there were only around 3,000 lawyers in the PRC, a country of approximately 1 billion people at that time. And all of these lawyers were state officials by definition at that time. By 2018, China had a total of 400,000 registered lawyers, and the total number of law firms practicing in the country surpassed 30,000, these law firms. Most of them are now administrated outside of the system, and some play the role of protecting the rights for the public against the state. Now, China's legal education and profession are profoundly shaped and influenced by Western legal doctrines that have made their way to China through international education exchanges. Now, a good example is the birth and the growth of China's legal clinics, which were initiated and sponsored by Ford Foundation in the United States. You know, our mutual friend, the later Peter Geithner, the son of the Jim Geithner, the Treasury Secretary, played a very important role. I really miss him dearly, Steve. The same can be said about the Roots Foundation and another dear friend of the National Committee, Terry Laos. I hope that he is in the audience because I'm still in correspondence with him. I mean, he's a really wonderful man. Now, in recent years, a growing number of the Chinese students who had studied law in Western countries returned to China, where many now practice law in private law firms. You know, my book also had a case study of the Zhongren law firm, one of the top 5 private law firms in Shanghai. 75 of the 112 partners are foreign educated returnees, accounting for 2/3 of the total. Among these foreign educated returnee partners, 64% receive their JD degrees in the United States, usually like Columbia and Duke and Berkeley, Harvard, and etc., top schools. And most of them have passed the bar exam in New York and California. These are now people working in China for private firms or for the foreign joint venture. Now, another 25% in that law firm received a law degree in the United Kingdom. Now, with the United States and the other Western countries pressuring China, as we know, to meet international norm and the standards, especially in regard to enforcement and the compliance with the intellectual property rights, these Western educated Chinese lawyers may be instrumental in promoting both legal development in China and the cooperation across the Pacific in the years to come. So I'm not that completely pessimistic. I also see the other side, like so many things. We should not just simply jump to conclusion. That probably already explained Shanghai, despite still probably not reach the status like Hong Kong or London or New York. Of course, still there are a lot of barriers, but already attract a lot of talents, attract a lot of business. So that the dimension, we should not just go simplistic to see that the negative side. Yeah.
The issues, I think Shanghai has in place the human talent to become a financial center. And the book lays out, it has a very interesting data on the law firms, not only Zhonglen, but many of the others. It's very interesting how you've compiled that and where all these lawyers studied. And it lays out the argument that the human talent is there. But in my view, central government policies simply conflict with what is necessary to be a real financial center.
Yes.
It's partly it's censorship issues, it's independent judiciary issues, it's the ability to do research on a company, which you then may have to say this company's got serious problems, and publish that research. And that is, it's if you don't have an independent media doing that, then fraud goes uncovered because you can't, as an individual, do sufficient research. And then people lose confidence in the capital markets there.
Yeah.
So China, the central government, Shanghai, unless if they make it some kind of, free data zone, where, okay, anything goes in Shanghai. I don't think that's going to happen. Whereas in the rest of China, you couldn't do it. I think there's a Maodun in kind of Shanghai's desire to be an international financial center and central government policies, which make implementation of that extremely difficult.
I agree. I agree. I mean, my point is just the battle is not over yet. It's ongoing.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. And exactly the way you and I talk about what U.S. policy should be doing is enabling those who want reform to accomplish their policy objectives.
Absolutely.
That there are a lot of folks who share our views, and the policies that the previous administration took and appear to be taken by the current administration do not enable our friends, whether they're on the standing committee, the Politburo, the Central Committee, or they're lawyers in Shanghai. So I think you agree with that. Talk, because we're going to start running low on time. Oh, we are running low on time. You have the wonderful few chapters on the avant-garde art scene in Shanghai. Talk briefly about that and why you put that in the book and how it relates to your theme.
Well, by definition, avant-garde art is ahead of time. Let me show you one slide. I really want to show you these slides because my favorite chapter is about the art things in Shanghai. Let me share with you some of the slides. This is I spent a lot of time in China in 2019. This is actually the picture I took in December 2019. I happened to visit Moganshan 50号, the M50 Creative Park, Shanghai, and I took that photo. And the painting was made 2017 by Fujian origin artists who live in Shanghai, and it's called Imprinting of Times. I'm really at that time overwhelmed by that picture, but after COVID-19, when I looked at my camera, I mean, I really astonished by when I saw that again. And
visionary artist.
Oh my God, you can see, no one could have imagined then that this image would become an everyday scene around the world in the coming years. While the artist Wang Chenling probably might not foresees the scale and the scope of the impact of the pandemic of the century we are witnessing now, he apparently that forecasted in this incredibly powerful piece the degradation of ecology and the environment in today's world, and the inevitability of the SARS-like pandemic, and the loss of expression, emotion, and the compassion in human society, resulting with this kind of terrible, terrible disasters. Now, I actually started to look at the Shanghai's avant-garde artists a couple of decades ago. It shocked me early on to see the strong critical foresight of these artists' work. Not just to single out the authorities, but also point to globalization and its side effects, as the sand castle that I use as the beginning of the book. And also they criticize of the economic and the demographical disparities, environmental disasters and the degradation, single-minded profit-seeking, Western hypocrisies, and the arrogance of the U.S. hegemonic thinking. Now, many of those are reflection of China's post-colonial status and its globalized present and its need for complex societal and international negotiation. Now, let me want to show some other pieces. This is by famous Shanghai artist, Zhou Tiehai. I follow his work for almost 20 years, more than 20 years. This is a placebo. Yeah. That's famous that, certainly in that piece that Zhou Tiehai reimagined a capitalist yuppie as the Carmel, resembling Joe Carmel, who is the iconic image of the American cigarettes that China has imported. And Zhou Tiehai's cool Carmel reflects the artist the sarcastic point that a godfather figure's protection is necessary for Chinese people to stay safe. You can see the sarcasm in that one. Now, the other one that I saw actually immediately after he finished that piece is Mayor Giuliani. The piece was made in 2002. It's a big piece that I also took a lot of photos at that time. This one is downloaded from the art gallery. So certainly when I saw it, I immediately thought he tried to challenge American sentiments in the post 9/11 era, that as it marks the hero worship in the United States. As I grew up in China, I saw so many the Mao-like figures like these things. So he did the same things, but this time director challenge the United States. Now, some prominent Shanghai avant-garde artists are less critical of the United States. They point to the need that China should better understand the outside world. My favorite artist, his name is Ding Yi. This is, you can see, this exhibition is outside Washington, in the Kennedy, it's Kennedy Hall, right? He exhibited a few years ago, 10 years ago. And Ding Yi's, this is a Ruyi, as we know, it's based on the Chinese traditional, Ruyi, which served as a self-defense tool during war. That's the origin of the term, the material. And in the contemporary context, Ruyi is widely considered to be auspicious, used in folk communities and also mentions in the people's home alike. Now, this piece conveying the message that when traditional images are enlarged multiple times, their meaning and the impression can change completely. Another piece that
we're going to run out of time.
Okay.
Probably
let me finish.
And I want to get to some audience questions.
Okay, let's finish last one. That's Tai Chi. You and I all know about Tai Chi. Your audience, those familiar with Chinese culture, all know Tai Chi. In the Chinese conception, Tai Chi is often characterized as a gentle, indirect, and slow-moving, and relaxed, and reflecting the Chinese Taoism or Taoist worldview of yin-yang balance. But the posture of the Tai Chi practitioner here appears highly rigid, intense, and antagonistic. So Ding Yi intends to show the conception must be altered when the circumstances have profoundly changed. For Ding Yi, it is not just the West that should develop a more updated, balanced assessment of China's ongoing transformation, which is, of course, needed. Equally important, China also must better understand how its changing status may affect and be perceived by the outside world, especially United States. Now, these pieces highlight the importance of empathy in the rapidly changing global landscape from Chinese artists' point of view.
Great. Let me ask two audience questions, and then I want to close with two questions. So got to keep the answers brief. One's from Stephen Hu, who does research in Shanghai, University of California at Santa Barbara. Is there a particular spirit of Shanghai that has influence on Chinese political elites or the middle class there? I say this because most people who live in Shanghai are not from Shanghai or Shanghainese. And then Lawrence Sullivan from Adelphi asks, how many officials of the Xi Jinping anti-corruption campaign were from Shanghai?
Well, a couple of things. That certainly the Chinese use the term Hai Pai, Shanghai culture vis-a-vis Jing Pai. This is not something new. It has been around for 100 years since the May 4th movement, probably earlier. So try to make a point because of as immigrant city, it's a coastal city, it's a strong foreign influence. But also my book emphasized that the Shanghai has the three images, identities: local culture, national culture, and the cosmopolitan culture. They coexist together, make Shanghai quite unique in a way that there's a high level of tolerance, inclusiveness, and particularly, you're absolutely right that the Shanghai many of people in Shanghai not really originally from Shanghai. For example, I was born in Shanghai, but my father come from Ningbo, my mother come from Suzhou. So basically, that all these people that are from outside. So that constitutes Shanghai very much similar to New York in certain ways. So that make Shanghai is more emphasized on entrepreneurism and flexibility, pragmatism, not ideological, and the less concern, actually very paradoxical, less concern about political things. And then people make a comparison that the author of the so-called City Monsoon, he said that Beijing people love to talk about politics. Politics like the salt. Without it, the life is tasteless. Of course, it's a very funny quote. But Shanghai people love to talk about business. But this certainly has some truism. You see the different, in Shanghai restaurant, Beijing restaurant, you do see the contrast and etc. So that's probably is kind of Shanghai's unique culture, contribute its also current status, rather why this is from the tier city, right? Now, the second question about Xi Jinping's anti-corruption, one key person is Yang Xiaodu. He is the person next to Wang Qishan, the Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign. He was from Shanghai. He was born in Shanghai and also went to Shanghai Medical School. Actually, I know him reasonably well. When I visited Shanghai along with the later Shirley Yang, that we had lunch together in the Shanghai Expo, the things. At that time, he was a kind of a standing committee of Shanghai. Later, he moved on. He also spent many years in Tibet. He's currently the Politburo member and also in charge of anti-corruption at the moment, Yang Xiaodu. But other than that, not so many from Shanghai, because anti-corruption the chief person is Wang Qishan. Yang Xiaodu play far less important a role. Along with him, there's several other people. This is my answer to your question, to the question about the anti-corruption in Shanghai. Yes, Shanghai is relevant. Shanghai is important, but probably not important as Xi Jinping's own role and Wang Qishan at that time.
Last question will be at the end, towards the end of the book, you kind of try to summarize where we are, the decouplers, those who still believe in constructive engagement. I think I know where you come out on these, but you try to be rather fair. In fact, I would argue you were overly fair to the decouplers. You seem to agree with the statement that the Chinese economic miracle in the reform era has come at the relative expense of America's economic status in the world. Do you agree with that view? Because you said you're not surprised that this is a view. And then the part of that question is at the very end of the book, you have recommendations for the Biden administration. So my question would be, are they following those recommendations?
Well, as we know that FBI Director Christopher Wray described that when he still under the Trump administration, I think he probably continued to hold the same view now, that actually he said that the global economic landscape change in China's favor, over the past 2 or 3 decades, represents one of the largest transfer of wealth in human history. I actually agree with that assessment. And the rapid rise and the expansion of the middle class in China, documented in my book, shows this remarkable transfer of wealth. The middle class in the United States has gradually been shrinking. Although the reason is complicated, not just I want to blame China. No, I do not want to blame China. But the fact is, American middle class is shrinking at the time China's middle class is expanding very, very quickly. U.S. from 70% of the American population in the post-World War years to 61% of the in the early 1970s to 55% in 2000 and to about 50% today. Now, according to the statistic provided by World Inequality Database, I frequently use that to Chinese friends, that between 1980 to 2014, the United States, only the highest income group, top 20%, benefit from globalization. Their income increased by 100% to 200%, that group, top 20. But all other 4 income groups had little to no improvement. So that's very, very important. That explains why Donald Trump gets some support by middle class voters. On the contrary, all 5 income groups in China increased significantly. That explains the different views of the economic liberalization between the Chinese public and the US American public today. Now, despite the validity of some of the concerns and criticism mentioned above, the sensationalism stirred up by decouplers about China's rise as the US is a threat to US and a threat to world peace, and along with American excessive response to hold China back through all valuable means, I think is overreactive and misguided. So while the primary audience, as you know, that as I mentioned, of my book is American and the English-speaking world, I do want the Chinese readers to understand some valid criticism of China by the outside world. Now, for your question about I do have my last chapter has the 10 recommendations, 5 to Chinese.
Let me just stop on that. The fact that the American working class has not benefited really from globalization. And let's say that Ray means from 1990. That is based upon what's gone on domestically, that the inequality has increased and that the wealthy have benefited and the working class have not. But that's not really related to China. That China's share, that America's share of world GDP in 1990 was 26%. In 2020, it's 24%. There's been a 2% change. So China may have benefited at the expense of Europe, at the expense of Japan, at the expense of others, but not really at the expense of the United States. It's the wealthy that benefited at the expense of lower income Americans, at the expense of manufacturing jobs. So
well, I agree with you, Steve. So it's not right to blame everything to China. I'm absolutely with you, but the result is astonishing. Then people may not make it that kind of a logic. They think that we are shrinking middle class, China is expanding. So politicians use that to criticize China. But the number you mentioned that also statistics may not be complete. Let me show you. Could you see the chart?
Yes.
Okay, you can see this is you mentioned about from 1990s. The number is correct, but you look at from the 1961. U.S. GDP certainly declined. China increased.
But you can't use 1961. China had nothing in the world.
Let's see more.
It didn't join. You have to use 1990 because that is when China joined the WTO and began to play a material part in the world economy. It's to go back to 1960. I mean, China was effectively zero.
That's fair. But let's look at the trajectory. Let's look at the trajectory of PPP. This is by the IMF, the group. Look at the trajectory. If China maintains 5 to 4%, somewhere between 4 to 6%, it's the red line. US, if 3% is the middle. US, if 2% growth over trajectory. That's astonishing if that's true. Now, also, let's see the pies. This is the GDP, real GDP. Let's see the difference. United States is still way ahead of China, 24%, the number you use. China is 14%. But look at the PPP. China is already surpassed the United States. So these numbers may differ from the number you use. For American public, certainly some people become very, very nervous about these things. Certainly, I not necessarily agree with all these things, but I also want to tell the Chinese friend, they should have the empathy to see how US look at China's rise and look at China's economic practice. And because politicians will constantly use these numbers along with some other numbers to do that. Now, for your final question, that the Biden administration, I should say Biden administration is still the relatively early stage, not even for 4 months now. And also their China strategy is under review. probably will compete sometimes in summer, maybe longer, right? So I still wanted to be open about that. Certainly, I agree some of the policy approach. I hope that will fix the Trump's problems and etc. But not too many things have been fixed. But on the other hand, that we probably should be patient, particularly also understand why it's so difficult. But I'm very happy to see that the Biden put American middle class renewed as the overarching domestic agenda. I think this is a very, very encouraging. Now, let me conclude. I know that the time is up. Now, in this really period of uncertainty, that especially in the wake of the pandemic of the century, the two largest middle class countries in the world need to find a way to reshape their long-term engagement, not abandon engagement, but reshape the long-term engagement. The United States and China should strive to have a vision for shared future, confidence in their collective strengths, and the humility and the humanity in their beliefs. This is the final words of my book. Now I want to use that as final words for this conversation. I learned a great deal from very sharp questions, and sometimes we agree, sometimes we disagree. And
rarely do we disagree.
Okay, back to you. You have final words or final things to say. Yeah.
Well, this has been a wonderful discussion, which I hope has whetted the audience appetite to reading your book, Middle Class Shanghai: Reshaping U.S. China Engagement. It's really a must read, and I hope folks in the Biden administration read it too and are able to adopt the nuance in policy that you really strongly recommend, that we keep sight that Beijing is not the first, second, third, and final part of China, that we need to look at the rest of China, and we need to certainly look at Shanghai. It's a remarkable contribution to the way we should be thinking about China, and I can't thank you enough for this conversation and for all that you do for us. But thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us on this absolutely gorgeous afternoon in New York.
Thank you so much, Steve. Great.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.